Good morning. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. We're going to start this morning off with Seung Min Kim, White House reporter for the Washington Post. Seung Min, you've already had a long morning. I saw you on New Day early this morning. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about what you were talking about on New Day. It was about President Biden's $1.9 trillion covert relief package. Finally, they finished reading the 600 plus page bill on the floor of the Senate, and now the process really gets moving. Where are we in that process?
So we are right in the vote-a-rama stage, almost there, where senators will be voting on basically countless number of amendments. Most, if not basically all of them, will fail at the end of the day. We expect the President Biden's $1.9 trillion package to emerge relatively intact and then on to final passage. Remember that since there were some modifications made in the Senate version, so it does have to go back to the House before and pass again before it can go to the President Biden for his signature. Remember, one of the biggest differences is that the elimination of the $15 minimum wage increase. And that was a decision by the Senate parliamentarians saying that couldn't work under these arcane Senate budget rules. But there were also some other minor provisions as well. You know, they tightened the eligibility for those $1,400 stimulus checks. It's a minor savings in the grand scheme of things, saving only about $12 billion, but this is something that moderate Democrats had called for, saying we should try to make sure these checks are targeted towards people who actually need them. And also some other provisions that actually make it more generous, make the aid more generous for states with lower populations, particularly Alaska. And we know that Democrats in the White House certainly are supporting Senator Lisa Murkowski's vote. But that's what we're expecting right now. I think we're looking at perhaps sometime Saturday for final passage, but it'll be a lot of Senate floor action, a lot of voting, and probably some short tempers and a little bit of impatience.
All right, since you invoked her name, let's talk about it. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, she's sort of emerged as this wild card. Any indication as to how she might vote?
It's as good of a guess as yours. Your guess is as good as mine. Yesterday, she did vote against proceeding to the bill, which for most senators, most of the time is a pretty good indicator of where you are on the final legislation, but not necessarily for Lisa Murkowski. She has said she is open to the bill. Obviously, again, there were changes made to the bill that make the bill a little bit more generous for states like Alaska. And remember, she is up for re-election in 2022, and so much of her record, her brand, has been being very attentive to Alaska, the unique challenges that her state faces, being so far away from the 48 states, and the unique economic challenges that Alaska faces, and her track record able to deliver for her constituents. And obviously, a $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill is a way to do that. Now, were there sufficient changes made at the end of the day to appease her? That's to be determined.
Hmm.
But she is a vote that is being watched. And certainly the White House, even if it's just one Republican vote, the White House would love nothing more than Senator Lisa Murkowski to support this bill at the end of the day and to really undercut a Republican talking point that there would be unified GOP opposition to this bill. So that is really what Democrats and the White House are seeking right now. And Lisa Murkowski is leaving all of us guessing at this point.
Right. So they're all working on, the White House and Senate Democrats are working on this March 14th deadline. How likely is it that the Senate is going to meet that deadline? That's part one of a two-part question.
It seems likely at this point. Again, even if it does have to go back to the House to pass again before it goes to the president, it should be no problem. The issue is that the March 14th deadline, the way that the various states' unemployment insurance systems work, it's not like you can pass a bill right on March 13th or March 14th and everything will be okay. A lot of these benefits start to phase out in the days before then. So that's why they were looking at early March as a target for passage and signing into law by the president. It should still be okay, but they are certainly cutting it a little bit close.
And now the second part is, okay, so let's say they meet that March 14th deadline before March 14th. But given the slight changes that you were talking about earlier that are made to the Senate bill, and as you said, it has to go back to the House, how will it pass again in the House?
I think we are expecting that to happen. The minimum wage would have been certainly a question mark. You had progressives such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez saying she would still support the bill if, per se, the parliamentarian was the one who had to take it out of the bill. She would not support it if Democratic senators proactively took it out because she felt that this was a critical part of COVID relief legislation that should be in there. So on the minimum wage front, we expect the progressives to be okay with that being not in there at the end of the day. But the question mark is the tightened eligibility actually of those checks, because the way that it's now being written, there are, conceivably people who got stimulus checks under the Trump administration who are right at that cutoff, who won't be getting it under the Biden administration. And Democrats think that doesn't actually kind of make sense politically. But at the same time, these checks are bigger. They are certainly more generous. There are plenty of other provisions throughout the $1.9 trillion bill, besides these checks that benefit people who are truly suffering under this pandemic. And at the end of the day, Democratic leaders believe that will certainly get the bill across the finish line. But you do have progressives examining exactly why you had to change the eligibility for these checks and whether that was necessary in the first place.
And one more question before I let you go, and that is Texas and Mississippi just completely doing away with their mask mandates, completely reopening. President Biden called it quote unquote Neanderthal thinking. Is there anything else the White House can do other than the president saying that to compel Texas and Mississippi to reverse course?
They are certainly pressuring as much as they can. In addition to President Biden, you had Press Secretary Jen Psaki saying this is something that we disagree with, something that we discourage. Certainly, the CDC reemphasized again that governors should not be releasing mask mandates at this hour. But it is a state decision. There is not much that the federal government can do. Certainly, there's always conversation about, for example, federal aid, federal funding being contingent on certain activities by the state, but that's not necessarily a discussion that they're having right now, because at the end of the day, the Biden administration just wants to eradicate this pandemic as much as possible. And any sort of carrots or sticks approach that they can take from the federal government level to force, the Texas governors and the Mississippi governors to reverse their lifting of the mask mandate. And I'm not quite sure would help. I'm not quite sure would help them, in their progress in their fight against the pandemic. But it's certainly a political fight that we're going to see ensue over the next several weeks. The Republican senators from those states say while they themselves wear masks to the Capitol, they support what their governors are doing.
Seung Min, you know what?
What?
We're completely out of time. Just when we really get up and going. Seung Min Kim, White House reporter for the Washington Post. Thank you very much for coming back to First Look.
Thanks very much for having me.
And let's move over to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find my colleagues, Deputy Editorial Page Editor Ruth Marcus and Washington Post columnist Megan McArdle. Welcome to you both. Megan, I'm going to start with you, basically in the spot where I left the last question to Seung Min, and that is about Texas and Mississippi and what their governors are doing, lifting the mask mandates. Other states are doing things that are beginning to relax regulations. Your column that is in the actual physical Washington Post today is about how cities could take much longer to rebound once we get past the pandemic. And may not return to the way they were before. Walk us through some of the scenarios you envision happening to cities like Washington and New York.
Right. Okay. So cities like Washington and New York, they're built around a central business district, right? If you look at the infrastructure, it's all designed to funnel people into this pretty small area of the region. And if you think about what's happening there, nothing. You go into Midtown Manhattan and it is just dead. I stopped there a couple of days ago. I was walking through Midtown and I was thinking, I'm really tired because I had walked like 10 miles. Maybe I'll just get a cab. And then I realized you can't get a cab in Midtown. What am I saying? It's faster to walk. And then I realized, no, wait, it is faster to get a cab, but that's why I can't get a cab because there's no traffic, there's no stores open, right? And so you end up in this situation where you're trying to bring so much back at once, and it's really hard, right? How do you bring the cabs back before the shows are back and the stores are open, the bars? How do you have the bars without the shows and the restaurants and the office workers? And a lot of this is really dependent on a kind of three-legged stool of tourism, of office workers, and of residents of the area. That's also true of DC. The residents of the area are mostly still there. The office workers simply are not. People were saying Midtown offices right now, 10 or 20% of what they normally have. That's about the same in DC. Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, on and on and on. And the thing is, a lot of tourism flows, especially the high dollar long stay tourism, is international. That's not coming back this year. And then the office workers, a lot of people are looking at going to hybrid models where you're in a few days a week, you're out a few days a week, or you're working remote all the time. Those workers will never be back in the same numbers that they were. And the thing is that each of these workers is subsidizing the other, right? So you sell your lunches to the office workers, and then you sell early theater dinners to people who are going to the theater or, the Kennedy Center or what have you. And then you sell your anniversary and birthday dinners and business travelers. And if you pull one of those things out, the whole thing gets more expensive, which makes it less attractive, which makes it harder to get the area back up. And so it is this very delicate process that is at the very least going to take longer than you think and longer than just getting people vaccinated. And to the extent that you need those office workers there to anchor the other stuff, the taxis and all the rest of it, it may never come back to exactly what it was.
And Ruth, you also wrote about New York, but about New York's embattled Governor Andrew Cuomo and specifically the very serious allegations of sexual harassment against him. You wrote in a column that you actually see some glimmers of hope. You wrote, quote, "What once was commonplace, bosses asking out subordinates, coworkers making crude sexual remarks, is now understood to be forbidden, a career killer." Talk us through that.
Well, first of all, that was quite the elegant New York segue there, Jonathan. Congrats on that. So I do think, and I have covered now 3 decades of men behaving badly. And sorry, it is male politicians and mostly male corporate executives behaving badly. And we've seen an increasing intolerance in the best sense of the word intolerance, an increasing understanding that that sort of behavior cannot be tolerated and will not be tolerated in the private sector where Cuomo would already be gone, or in the public sector where he is very, very wobbly at best. And an understanding that even things that fall short of chasing someone around a desk and propositioning her outright are also unacceptable behavior. And male politicians have somewhat changed their behavior. You can oddly see this in some of the reports of Cuomo, who seemed to think he was playing by some new set of rules because he didn't, according to one of the accusers, he didn't directly say or directly ask her out, but sort of opened the door to gauge her interest. I want to be clear, this is intolerable. It is not okay. Things are better in terms of increased understanding. Some people have improved their behavior. Cuomo has not. And I want to just get this one completely off my chest. I thought that his apology was beyond unacceptable, because the notion that he did not understand that what he did was wrong, but now he does, now that it's been mentioned to him, just a bunch of bunk, okay? If one of his daughters had come to him and said, Daddy, this is what happened to me in my workplace, and this is what my boss said, he would have gone to the guy's office and punched him in the nose. And you cannot behave that way. Don't tell me that you've now just figured that out. You didn't just figure that out.
And Ruth, on the one hand, I think you're right. There is that glimmer of hope that we all now recognize that it's, for, as you write, forbidden a career killer. Except the other thing that seems to have happened in the old days, by now he probably would have been driven out of office, had resigned, and yet instead, in that, as you say, apology, he also refused to resign. What do you make of that in terms of our culture now, that politicians can get into trouble of their own making, and then they decide, as one Republican operative said to me during, I think it was during the Governor Northam controversy over his yearbook page, that he was going to, quote, brazen it out. We've seen more and more politicians, especially during the Trump years and now going forward, brazening it out. What do you make of that?
Jonathan, you took that phrase right out of my mouth. But brazening it out is not a new development. Bill Clinton brazened it out back in the Monica Lewinsky days. Astonishingly, I did not remember this part of it until I went to check the clips. Bob Packwood, Republican senator from Oregon, who had engaged in an unbelievable array, which he captured in his diary, of gross misbehavior towards propositioning any number of women who worked in his office. It took 3 years after the first Washington Post report about his misconduct for him to leave. So brazening out is a pretty old tactic. I actually think it has less salience now than it does previously. Just ask ask former Senator Al Franken about that, because there is less tolerance. On the other hand, one thing we still haven't figured out is how to make this good new reality work, of a much lower, much higher bar for what's acceptable behavior. How do we deal? We know how to deal with that in the private sector. You know, and I know that if somebody in our workplace had engaged in what Governor Cuomo had engaged in, they would be out the door. And if they weren't out the door immediately, it would be them who would be transferred to a different department and taken away managerial responsibilities. It's a little bit more complicated to do that when you're dealing with a public figure who has been elected by the voters. You can't transfer the governor to another department. And while he could be impeached, in the end, it's really only voters who can fire him. So we're still working through how to deal with this issue when it comes to public officials.
And Megan, go ahead. Sorry, Ruth.
Let's just elect more women and see if we have fewer problems.
Hey, I am all for that. Megan, let me bring you into this conversation, and whatever thoughts you have on Governor Cuomo and the sexual harassment allegations against him, I'd love to hear them. But also, that's not the only thing that Governor Cuomo is dealing with. He's got the nursing home scandal. And talk about what's going on in terms of the nursing home scandal, because it's one story that I haven't paid too much attention to, but this much I know: the number of deaths at nursing homes were being downplayed, if not completely being disregarded by the Cuomo administration. What do you think as to whether the nursing home piece of this will have real consequences for Governor Cuomo?
I think, look, Ruth is absolutely right. You have this problem with elected people, right? You saw this with Kim Davis, the county clerk in Kentucky, who didn't want to issue gay marriage licenses, and normally to transfer her to something else and let her issue driver's licenses or something. But you can't do that because it was an elected position. She couldn't be fired because it's an elected position, and so it ended up with this ridiculous sort of endless, the judge putting her in contempt of court rather than quietly separating her from her job in one way or another. And Cuomo does have that same problem. The thing about Cuomo is a couple of things. First of all, he's in a blue state, so it's pretty low cost for Democrats to take a principled stand here. It has proven harder for them to take principled stands in states where they fear that they're handing the seat over to a member of the other party. And I think, of course, you see the same thing with Republicans. But with Cuomo, it's a little more complicated than that. He's not super well liked by the legislature. He's unlikely to be impeached for a bunch of reasons, but he, so ultimately it might come down to, if he just sticks it out as Northam did in Virginia, it could be up to the voters to save him. Well, so Andrew Cuomo, during the early days of the pandemic, wanted to clear hospital beds. And the way that they did that was that they ordered nursing homes to take COVID positive patients who had been discharged from hospitals. Of course, this is, you're putting people into the most vulnerable population where this thing could spread like wildfire. It was roundly criticized at the time, but the numbers didn't seem to be that bad. Well, come a year later, not quite a year later, and it turns out that what they did was they only counted people who had died in the nursing homes. They didn't count people from nursing homes who had then died in hospital. And of course, a lot of people do die in hospital. They're sent there to be put on ventilators, to have last-ditch efforts. That had been part of the problem in the first place. And the legislature is outraged. And so he is on shaky ground on a number of fronts. He can bullet out and try to go to the election, but people are very sensitive about those nursing home questions, and I doubt he'll make it. He does.
New York governors in third terms, that's a really hard reality for them. Let's talk about some other governors, Ruth, the governors of Texas and Mississippi. And you sent out a tweet. I don't know when this tweet was sent out, but it was this week, within a couple of days. You tweeted out, wondering when the governors of Texas and Mississippi are planning to lift seatbelt laws and speed limits, also stop signs, school vaccination requirements, etc. Neanderthal is too kind a term for this irresponsible move. The irresponsible move being lifting the mask mandates and completely reopening their states. Is there any recourse to those decisions?
I don't think, as you asked Seung Min, I don't think there's any effective in time or potentially constitutional federal recourse. The recourse is to elect governors who have some understanding that we do need responsible government. Even Megan, libertarian that she is, agrees with me on this. We have rules in place, mask rules, seatbelt laws, vaccination rules for kids in schools. The Governor Abbott said, well, Texans know how to behave responsibly. Well, look at the bars and restaurants in Texas and the masking or lack of masking that's going on there. A, they do not. And B, when they do not, it doesn't just have implications for them and consequences for them. It has consequences for their fellow Texans, and not just consequences for their fellow Texans, because we're a mobile society, and what happens in Texas and Mississippi isn't going to stay in Texas and Mississippi. People get on planes, people get in cars, they get infected, they travel elsewhere. This is the most irresponsible behavior at precisely the wrong time.
I'm sorry, I can't believe states, those governors have done that. Megan, what's your reaction?
Okay, so let me try to mount, first of all, the case that I don't agree with, but that this, I think, is the best defense of this, right? First thing is that having a mask mandate is not this, you don't get the same effect as you would if everyone actually wore masks, right? So one thing that you can argue is that these aren't really that effective. And I think that that's probably true on net, is that the lockdowns and the mask mandates, if everyone actually obeyed them all of the time, they would be super effective. They're modestly effective, but they are still effective. And when you're arguing that they're not effective, you're basically arguing against the laws of physics and biology. The other thing I think you could say is, look, as with schools, there is some trade-off here. There may be some infection, but people are losing businesses every day. We have now vaccinated most of all our most vulnerable populations. And you could make an argument that as we're getting towards that point, I think, maybe it's just not worth losing the marginal businesses, the many businesses, in order to produce marginal safety gains. However, that's where you get back to the mask mandates. On the one hand, not as effective as if everyone wore their mask, even indoors, never saw friends without masks indoors. On the other hand, they're so low cost, right? I mean, this is like the least thing you can do. And in some ways, it might actually help you reopen if people feel safer in shopping malls, for example. So why do it? It's symbolic politics. And this is something that the Republican Party is just spending way too much time on. They're spending way too much time on saying, I won't, and you can't make me, to own the libs. rather than sort of crafting a positive policy vision. And this goes way beyond COVID. It is kind of an irresponsible abdication of their obligation, not just to the country, but to themselves, to win national elections, to serve their voters, their own voters, the people who put them in office. This symbolic politics, it's fun, it does well on camera, but it is absolutely destructive to both the party and the country.
And you know what, Megan, and that gets to a much bigger conversation that we should have, but we only have 4 minutes left. But Sophia Nelson, Republican woman who tweeted out last night, that Republicans seem to be against mask mandates, against voting rights, against a whole lot of things. But what are you for? And I think hopefully maybe on another first look, we can come back and have that larger discussion about what the Republican Party argues to the nation about what they're for, what they're going to do. But in the little time that we have left, this is something I didn't know until recently, actually a few minutes ago. YouTube announced yesterday that it would allow Donald Trump back on its platform once, quote, the risk of violence has decreased. But with Donald Trump still claiming that the election was stolen from him, Ruth, then Megan, do you think this is inviting insurrectionary activity for the country, especially since yesterday, there was fear that, QAnon folks would rush back to Washington because they believe that Donald Trump was going to really be re-inaugurated to a second term?
The House of Representatives was not in session yesterday because of a fear of violence. I'm not really sure how YouTube is going to be the best arbiter of violence. That's not a static moment. If you say, okay, well, he can come back once the threat of violence has diminished, well, he is the creator, really, the inciter of the threat of violence. And so he creates and amplifies his own reality. We would not have had January 6th if it hadn't been for Donald Trump claiming that it was going to be a rigged election, claiming that the election was stolen from him, asking people to protest it, summoning them to Washington, and everything else. That said, and I suspect Megan is going to amplify on this, I'm not completely comfortable with banning people from platforms, even if they are people purveying the misstatements and inciting the potential violence that Donald Trump is. I think if he's making misstatements, I can understand getting him off there. Deciding that he is just too dangerous to be allowed to speak is something that makes me awfully nervous.
And Megan, in the 1 minute we have left, your thoughts, particularly the free speech argument that supports his reinstatement.
Yeah, look, on the one hand, Google is a private company. They're entitled to decide who they're going to put on their pages, just as we probably would not run an op-ed by Donald Trump saying, actually, I won the election and everyone should come back to DC and have a big protest. I don't know, maybe we would. I don't know. Ruth's face was reward enough for making speculation. But at the same time, they are so broad and ubiquitous as to kind of approach acting a little bit more like the government that I'm comfortable with. And I think that this is something that libertarians are really going to have to grapple with, but all of us, is that in a lot of these markets, the efficient number of players is one, right? It is actually just more efficient to have one big video platform than a bunch of small ones. And when you see that, I don't think it's the same as government power. Ultimately, Google's not going to come to my house with a gun and make me obey if I choose to ignore their edicts. But it's closer. And I think that we need to figure out a way to have some rules, some cultural rules, not necessarily legal rules, around, how much of that power that they exercise. Because while I have to say I am so happy I don't have to deal with Donald Trump's tweets and videos and all the rest of it, I also am really, really uncomfortable in a world where Google is deciding what I can and cannot see.
As always, we are out of time just when the conversation is not only getting good, but getting very deep. Megan McArdle, Ruth Marcus, thank you very much for coming back to First Look.
Great to see everybody.
Have a good weekend. And as always, thank you for tuning in. Washington Post Live will be back today at 12 p.m. Eastern. My colleague Heather Long will talk with the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, Neil Kashkari, about his views on the country's long-term economic outlook. And if it's Friday, that means I'll be on PBS NewsHour for Brooks and Capehart. Check your local listings. And then on Sunday, 10 a.m. Eastern, watch me on MSNBC for the Sunday show. In the meantime, I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Thank you very much for tuning into Washington Post Live's First Look.